Ah, thank you, Alan. Good call. I totally forgot about that. Um, so I want to just very briefly, not going to talk about any specifics from last week, but that the just to remind us all that the larger context into which Hasidism is born has a number of different vacuums that Hasidism is able to fill for the Eastern European Jews. So there's a vacuum of Jewish leadership at the time, and we're talking about, the early to mid 18th century here in Eastern Europe, but really early Hasidism all takes place within a geographical area that is basically modern day Ukraine. That's where the Ba'al Shem Tov does pretty much all of his work. That's where the Maggid of Mezeritch, we're going to talk about all these people tonight. Ba'al Shem Tov, master of the good name. Maggid is Hebrew for preacher. Mezeritch is one of the Eastern European towns. It's where he was, he really set up shop. Nachman of Bratzlav, that's also in Ukraine. So there's a lot. Ukraine is the cradle of Hasidism, and even though Ukraine was not an independent country at the time, it did have its own culture.
It was that Galicia, right?
I guess
I think so.
you think Ukraine and Galicia are synonymous? Yeah, it could
They're
be.
roughly, and parts of it are now, Austria and anyway.
Yeah, the maps are crazy because so many, right, you had the Ottoman Empire, you had the Austro-Hungarian Empire, you had the Kingdom of Poland and the Kingdom of Russia, and all of these geographical boundaries shifted
Right.
sometimes dramatically over the course of relatively short periods of time. So let's go with yes, yeah. There's this phrase Galicianer, if for Jewish people whose ancestors came from that region. So there was a vacuum of leadership, and that had a couple of different dimensions to Jewish leadership. One dimension is that kind of the traditional, the way that kind of mainstream religious leadership was developed was through Talmud study. So a lot of the main leaders of all the Jewish communities, in Europe and probably, among the Middle Eastern communities and the Sephardic communities as well, if you were a kind of a rabbinic person who had this traditional path of learning a certain amount of Jewish law and then being ordained, and that was, how you became a rabbi. And rabbis were mostly focused on, they were kind of like judges. They were mostly focused on giving responses of what Jewish law says about certain situations. That's what most of the work of the rabbi was at that time. There was relatively little, there wasn't a lot of counseling. There wasn't a lot of preaching, actually. Rabbis didn't give sermons. It was these Maggidim, these preachers, who mostly they were itinerant, and they would move, from town to town, and they would come through on Shabbat, and they would give sermons, and that was their specialty. And rabbis didn't do that for the most part. When they got up and spoke, they talked about Jewish law, which was really twice a year. Before Pesach, they would remind people of the laws of how to observe Passover. That was one time. And then the Shabbat between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, Shabbat Shuvah, where they would talk about repentance. And both of those talks, both of those sermons were very legally driven. They didn't draw on a lot of midrash. That that was what the Maggid did, not the rabbis. So anyway, so there were the rabbis, and then there were kind of the civic lay leaders who tended to come from the wealthier classes, and those two groups had a good relationship with one another, but a lot of the Jews who were poorer didn't feel like either the rabbinic leadership or the civic leadership cared a lot about them. So that was one kind of vacuum that existed at the time. Another kind of vacuum, we talked a lot last week about Shabtai Tzvi, the false messiah, and how when his project of bringing all the Jews back to Palestine, completely fell apart, and a lot of the more mystically oriented Jewish leadership realized that this whole messianic element was a problem, and it was a problem because it became a problem because so many non-rabbinic Jews had been exposed to this mystical messianism, and so they kind of closed up. They really retreated into these more esoteric, closed circles of mystical conversation that didn't include, the average Jewish person, and so they weren't out there, engaging with the people in the street, because they were focused on their own little groups. There was a vacuum of faith to a certain extent, again, kind of still in response to the failure of Shabtai Tzvi and the tremendous enthusiasm that he had generated, and then the equally tremendous disappointment that came in its wake when he converted to Islam. So, and things were tough. Things were tough for a lot of Jewish people. There was still persecution coming from the surrounding societies, and people were dealing with poverty, and so things were not easy. And this, whereas people for a couple of generations had lived with this anticipation that maybe the Messiah was right around the corner, that did not exist for people anymore. So there was this vacuum of faith. So there was a lot that the Jewish community was in need of at the time that the Ba'al Shem Tov, the master of the good name, kind of broke onto the scene and started teaching. All right, that's one kind of introductory piece. The second piece, I just want to review and maybe fill in a couple of things about kind of these core. Oh, wait, we have Dan, you have a question.
It's me, yes. So back in the old days when I was sort of obsessed with the Hasidim, really just a Hebrew question I'm asking. I'll just get to it. Master of the good name, is it just as legitimate a translation to say master of the divine name? Because that's the other one I've seen, but I don't actually know the Hebrew.
Yeah, I mean, the literal Hebrew is, the word is tov, which is good, but I think everyone understood that when you were called a Ba'al Shem, a master of the name, you knew how to use the holy names of God
Yes,
to affect the world. That's what a Ba'al Shem was, known for. So yeah, I would say, how to manipulate the 4-letter tetragrammaton was, a piece of that, but there were lots of other names of God that were part of that, mystical, magical lore. So yes, they were all divine names that is why people qualified for that title, because they knew how to use those names to get things done. So the story goes. Thank you, Dan, for that question. So this just kind of, a big picture of Hasidism, and then we're going to dive into, to the specific personalities of the Ba'al Shem Tov the Maggid of Mezeritch, and if we get to Shneur Zalman of Liadi tonight, we'll get that. He's the third person we have on the docket this evening. So these two older Kabbalistic concepts, and really they go all the way back to the Talmud, both of these concepts, but the Hasidic philosophy really put these things at the center. And these concepts, one is in Aramaic, Leit atar panui mine, which means there is no place empty of him or it. This idea that divinity is present in all places, that goes all the way back to the Talmud. It was picked up by the Kabbalah, and then the Hasidim really put it at the center of their approach. And then the other phrase, which I know last week we talked about too, we know from the prayer book, Malokol haaretz kavodo, the fullness of the whole earth is divine glory. So again, both of these concepts point towards the saturation or oversaturation of the material world with divine energies. And so for Hasidic Jews, that was kind of step number one, is that anything that looks material has definitively this kind of spiritual component that may not be, you may not perceive it, but it's there. That notion of perception. So then there's this whole intersecting group of concepts that all relate to, well, what do you do about the fact if you come to believe or realize that there is this divine dimension to everything in the material world? Well, what are the implications of that? So there are a few, and they all are interrelated. So this idea, there's this phrase, mochin de gadlut and mochin de katnut, which roughly translates as expanded consciousness or constricted consciousness. Katnut is small or constricted. Gadlut is great or expanded. And the Hasidic Jews, and this concept I think also predates Hasidism. It was part of Kabbalah, pre-Hasidic Kabbalah, but again, Hasidism makes a lot of use of this phrase because for them, when you manage to achieve this expanded consciousness is when you can begin to perceive the divine dimension in the material world. That's one of the consequences, or one of the capabilities that comes with this expanded consciousness. And they recognize that most people don't live in expanded consciousness, but most people, or many people, have moments when that's the case. And so it's something that you can reach for. You can, if you know that divine dimension is present all the time, there are ways that you can try to stimulate your awareness so that it moves into an expanded consciousness place. And so just that idea that we move back and forth between constriction and expansion, except unless you're a tzaddik, unless you're a Rebbe. And if you're a tzaddik, theoretically, a tzaddik is capable of living all the time in expanded consciousness. So that's one of the distinctions between the tzaddikim, the highly evolved leaders of the Hasidic world, and the Hasidim, those people who follow them. Another related concept to this idea is dveikut, which means to connect or to cleave to stay connected with. And Hasidic Judaism taught about if divine energies are always present, we can make the effort to connect to those divine energies. And I'm using my language for this. Some people would say, God is present in all of material reality. And so dveikut means connecting with God or the divine. So that's a central value and concept in Hasidism is connecting, because it's always a possibility, because there is no place that is empty of God. So that's Dvekut. Another idea that is connected with this is this notion, in Hebrew, it's avodah begashmiut, service in the material world. So Hasidic philosophy very strongly recognizes that because the divine is everywhere, we are never in a situation where we can't be doing something that is for the benefit of, if you want traditionally, in traditional language, serving God, or for the good of the cosmos, or, lifting, moving the world towards redemption, whatever kind of language you want to use. But in contrast to some parts of more traditional rabbinic Judaism, which would say there are moments that are more appropriate for serving God, and there are moments where, it's more, there's Kodesh and there's Chol. There's holiness and there is the everyday. Well, for Hasidic Judaism, there is no everyday. Everything is Kodesh, potentially. And we have the opportunity to be serving the divine in every moment, in every interaction, and we're gonna see that. Joy becomes very important in Hasidic Judaism. Most of the pre-Hasidic mystics were really into asceticism and denial, self-denial and self-flagellation and fasting. And we're going to see this. Ba'al Shem Tov and his followers said, no, that is not what this world is about. This world is at a place of abundance, and we should be striving for joy and not for, feeling, trying to put our physical bodies in a painful state. So that was another connected idea. And lastly, in this set of connected ideas is this notion of bitul, which, okay. Now I am blanking on a good English translation of bitul. It's like to expunge or to get rid of it. The idea is that you get rid of the illusion that there's this whole separate material reality, and that can affect us as human beings. We can get rid of our egos. That's one way it can happen, but we can also, again, when we're in Mochin de Gadlut, we see that the divine and the material are actually completely interpenetrating, one and the same thing. And so that's called, expunge is not the best translation, but I hope what I'm saying makes some sense to people, that it's, you see through the illusion of like this, hard material reality, and it's actually, you see its divinity as well. So the Rebbe, or the Tzaddik, is the one who can do all these things all the time. If you're a Chassid, probably not. This is how things developed in Hasidism. The Tzaddik was the guy, and it was almost always a guy, who had these capabilities. And if you were a Hasid, what you wanted to do was put yourself in relationship to a Tzaddik and be in the presence of the Tzaddik and learn from the Tzaddik, and the Tzaddik would help you both grow spiritually, but also the Tzaddik would use his or her power to help you in life, to help you resolve the challenges you were facing, because you as a Hasid didn't have the power or the capacity to go into, the upper worlds and fix the things that were wrong, so that someone who was ill could become healthy, or someone who was poor who could become, more well resourced. So the tzaddik kind of moves into this. It's really, I think, I'm not an expert on, the role of the guru in Hinduism, but I think it's not dissimilar. It feels like it's a very, you serve the tzaddik, you become a devotee of the tzaddik. Technically, you don't worship the tzaddik, but sometimes people did. Sometimes people did, because they were seen as kind of, by some of their Hasidim, they were seen as kind of semi-divine beings almost. Okay. Let's jump in to the Ba'al Shem Tov. Oh, there's this really great quote from Rabbi Michael Strassfeld that I thought I might this kind of sums up the whole thing we've been talking about, and he does a really nice job. He says, Hasidism, I'm going to wait. I'm going to use this at the end. Actually. Okay. Let's start talking about the Ba'al Shem Tov. Now, the Ba'al Shem Tov, it is really difficult and probably impossible to separate myth from history in terms of the stories of the Ba'al Shem Tov. There just isn't very much reliable history. And most of it, comes from texts that were already viewing him in mythic terms. So different people do their best to try to piece together the basic elements of his life. So his name, Israel ben Eliezer, Israel the son of Eliezer, who was known as the Ba'al Shem Tov, and Ba'al Shem Tov was contracted to the acronym BEST. Just say best, but add an extra H in there, the BEST. He was born probably in 1698, and he lived until 1760. He was like other Ba'alei Shem, other masters of the name, he was a healer, he was a miracle worker, he was a mystic, and he made his life, most of his life, he lived in this city, this Galician/Ukrainian city of Mezeritch. There, how you like that? I'm sure I'm butchering that, but I'm not even gonna try to spell it for you. And he is recognized as the founder of Hasidism. He was born in a small village called Okopi that had recently, it had been a military outpost that had been recently made into a civilian village, and that's where he was born. He apparently lost both parents by the time he was 5, and he was, the community kind of adopted him and helped take care of him. There was a region called Podolia in this part of Galicia, Ukraine, and he spent his early life in many of the towns in Podolia. He started off, I think as a young child, as an infant, he was in a place called Tulust. Again, these names, I don't know that they're so important, but and that's where he and his parents lived, and that's where his parents passed away. And that is the community that kind of adopted him and gave him jobs and took care of him. So as a young man, he worked at a variety of jobs. He worked as a ritual slaughterer, a shochet. He was an elementary school teacher, and he apparently also circumcised male babies. He learned and knew Rabbinic Hebrew and Aramaic from his own education. He was not exactly a Talmudist. He was not, super grounded in rabbinic law. But but he was conversant with it. He also intentionally worked at learning practical and contemplative Kabbalah. He studied Kabbalah, and he found people in his city who were scholars of Kabbalah, and he sought them out and he studied with them. He also proactively went about learning how different herbs and plants could be used as remedies for physical ailments. And he pursued that knowledge among both Jews and non-Jews. His wife, he actually was married twice, but his first wife died very soon after they were married, and his second wife, Hannah, was a divorcee, and she was the sister of a prominent scholar in the town named Gershon of Kitev, and the two of them had two children, a son who never became prominent, and a daughter named Hodel, who some of you the name you'll recognize from Fiddler on the Roof. Hodel, a very common Eastern European name, Yiddish name. And Hodel had descendants who played significant roles in the later Hasidic movement. In fact, Rebbe Nachman of Bratzlav was Hodel's grandson. At some point in the 1730s, so he's in his early 30s, there are some parallels to Jesus here too. It's kind of interesting. In the 1730s, the Ba'al Shem Tov, Israel began using the title of Ba'al Shem or Ba'al Shem Tov. And that signaled he was coming out to his community as a healer and as what we would call a shaman. He could mediate between this world and the divine realms, and in that culture, that's how it was understood. And he would help people solve their health, material, and social problems. He put himself out there as someone who could do that. He apparently was quite charismatic. He was very self-confident. He had a great sense of humor. He was clever, and he believed that he had a key role to play as a leader in the Jewish community, and that he could help the Jewish community and the Jewish people. He had that sense of himself. He was apparently very successful as a Ba'al Shem. People came to him. He was able to heal people, or at least they experienced him as a healer successfully. And so he kind of made it onto the radar screen of the leaders of Mezeritch, the city where he was living. And the leaders said, basically, would you be our resident Ba'al Shem, our resident Kabbalist, and we'll give you a house to live in, and you won't have to pay for it. So that was a very nice thing that he got. He also was expected to be the leader of the local study house, the Beit Midrash, in his role as the Ba'al Shem of the city. That was part of the responsibility. And there were other people there who were students of Kabbalah who studied with him. But by that time, he was being seen as kind of like the main teacher in that city. He would write amulets for people, prescribe cures, and interpret unusual happenings that would come into their lives. If someone had a misfortune, if the community suffered some persecution, if there was an epidemic in the community, these were all seen as a symptom of disruptions in the harmonious relationship between the divine and the human. This is coming out of earlier Kabbalah. That was always understood, that when things in the material world were going badly, that was a reflection of things in the spiritual world not being in alignment. He would engage in what he called these ascents. He would take an ascent of the soul. He would, we're going to actually, if we have time, we're going to read one of the few texts that seem to be an authentic to him writing it. Is a letter that he sent to his brother-in-law where he describes one of these ascents that he went on. But it was in these experiences that he'd have where, he would go into the divine world, and that's how he would try to fix things in the material world. He would kind of take a look behind the curtain and try to figure out what could be done to change the situation on the ground, literally. Okay. One of the things that made him the Ba'al Shem Tov and not just a Ba'al Shem is that most Ba'alei Shem only dealt with individual problems, but he also was trying to help the community as a collective. And that made him fairly different from the other Ba'alei Shem that were, around at the time, apparently. In the study hall, in the Beit Midrash, he would lead his circle of students in Kabbalistic rituals. He would add special kavanot, a special kind of intention or focus to the prayers, to the normal prayer ritual. His associates, his students, considered him an expert in the wisdom of divinity and knowledgeable in the metaphysics of the human soul. And many of his students reported that he was capable of moving them to a higher, more vital level of experience. So he had the ability, not just for himself, but for others as well. Ba'al Shem Tov, he was involved in public life, as we talked about. Not always, spiritual in the strict sense of the term. Sometimes there would be arguments and fights between different aspects of the community. So apparently, there was a huge argument between the butchers and there was another rabbi in town who sided with the butchers, and the Jewish community were complaining about like the high price of kosher meat or something we can identify with, some of us. And he took the side of the people. He advocated, he argued against this other rabbi and against the butchers in town. And so he kind of became a hero in that way to the common residents of Mezeritch. He also had contact with the Christian community. He met with Christian noblemen and even with priests. And again, these are stories, we have to be careful, but in the stories, he meets with people who are criminals as well. All kinds of people came to him because he had a great reputation as a healer. So not just in the Jewish community, people would come to him to seek out healing. And that would also give him some leverage if there were issues that came up between the Jewish community and the surrounding community. He had some power because people really respected him outside of the Jewish community too and appreciated him, and so he could advocate for the Jewish community when necessary. His reputation spread beyond Mezeritch and even beyond the region of Podolia. He was known in Lithuania, which was the part of Eastern Europe that was most resistant to the influence of Hasidism. The opposers, the opposition, the mitnagdim, those who resented and were suspicious of the Hasidim, their power center was in Lithuania. But even there, the Ba'al Shem Tov had his admirers because he had this reputation. His brother-in-law was part of a group of pilgrims that went to live in the Holy Land. And there was a group of Kabbalists who lived in Jerusalem, and apparently his brother-in-law would tell stories to these Kabbalists about the Ba'al Shem Tov, and they were all impressed with the stories that they heard about this guy, in Galicia who could do all these things. Besides communal leadership, he also served as kind of the head of the household and the head of his extended family. And he was responsible for their material and spiritual well-being also. This same brother-in-law that I just mentioned, who was living in Jerusalem, would ask the Ba'al Shem Tov to send prophylactic amulets to Jerusalem, to protect him, to protect the brother-in-law and other people there from, evil influences, and also financial support. He asked for that. The teaching of the Ba'al Shem Tov emphasized several older Kabbalistic concepts. We've talked about a lot of these already. The idea of there is no place empty of God, that was important in the Ba'al Shem Tov's teachings. This idea of serving God through the material world, that was part of his teachings, including, the experience of eating and of going to work, on a regular basis, and physical intimacy were all experiences where he taught you could have this way of serving the divine, even as you engaged in these, very physical acts. On the other hand, paradoxically, he also taught that a person should practice something called hishtavut, which translates often as indifference, but it's this idea, there's a better word for it, where you basically look at all your experiences in the same way. You don't, it doesn't bother you. This is the ideal. It shouldn't bother us if someone criticizes us, and we shouldn't get too excited if someone praises us. It's, it's kind of, someone give me I know there's a word in
equanimity.
Equanimity. Thank you, Mark. Thank you very much. Okay, equanimity. Yep. Musar to the rescue. Okay, that's great. Yes, it's equanimity. Let's see. The Ba'al Shem Tov's main technique for attaining a state of communion was ecstatic prayer. He would engage in a spiritual attachment to the holiness inherent in the letters of the texts that he was praying, and he saw this holy light in the letters. If he could enter into communion via the letters of the prayer book, that could induce the divine overflow to descend through the various worlds and bring its splendor into the material world. The sounds created by pronouncing the letters of prayer or of sacred texts in a state of ecstasy, if you had the right intent and the proper concentration, would become themselves sanctuaries for housing the divine light in this world. So you could evoke the divine energies if you pronounced the words the correct way, or if you visioned the letters in the correct way. The Ba'al Shem Tov was said to be able to use the divine light from the letters of the prayer book to see beyond the present moment, into the future, into the past, to be able to see, distant places that physically shouldn't be possible, and to connect with the metaphysical and supernatural levels of the world. Spiritually, let me just, I know this is a lot of material, and we're getting close to the conclusion of the Ba'al Shem Tov, but I want to stop and see if anybody has any questions or comments before we go into the final little piece of the Ba'al Shem Tov here. Lila?
I've got two questions. And
Right.
one is that the stories of the Ba'al Shem Tov, are those stories about him or stories that he told?
Both.
Okay.
Both. Yeah. There are lots and lots of stories about him, but those stories were written down. Again, I'm going to say this is another parallel with Jesus. They were written down 40 to 50 years
Ah,
after he died. So there is the historical, on top of the fact that the stories are, just wild and, just out of beyond the norm of
yeah.
human experience. But yeah, so but he and most Hasidic teachers would use parables to teach their lessons.
Okay.
So yeah, so it's both.
All right. And so the second question is, what does ecstatic prayer look like?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So
Like I'm picturing people at deadheads at a Grateful Dead.
I think that's not a bad.
I can
Yeah,
help with that. Sorry to jump in, but
yeah. Go ahead, Dan.
if I was gonna say, if you want to turn on sharing, the thing is, so this is a strange thing in the world. The Hasidim don't use a lot of the technology we do, but they're all over YouTube. So if you want to see, that can quite easily be arranged.
Yeah, thank you.
So do you want me to?
If we want to do it, I could put you as a co-host.
Yeah, give me a sec. I'll go. I can
Do we
easily
want to do it?
find.
That's Steve's.
This is
your call.
easy to do.
let me. I wanna pull the class here. If we could keep it to like 30 or 45 seconds, would people be interested in seeing a video of an ecstatic prayer experience? Okay, let's do that. All right, so yeah, Alan, if you could give Dan the power to share his screen and
Hang on, I'm just trying to find a good one here.
While you're looking, Dan, I'll just say I've mostly in Jerusalem is where I've seen examples of ecstatic prayer, and I have seen people, and these were traditional Jewish men. They were Orthodox, Hasidic Orthodox, and they would be jumping very high, jumping up and down and clapping their hands with a lot of force. And sometimes they would just shout, not even a word, but just a sound. And, maybe more stereotypically, there would be a lot of, physical dancing together. And, loud, boisterous singing. Yeah, you gotta. Okay.
Yeah, so this is just called Fantastic Hasidic Dance, and I can see enough from the clip that it's more or less what we want.
Okay.
So I haven't actually previewed this, but I've seen the genre. So this is only 41 seconds.
Okay, perfect.
We will call it good enough. Hang on a second. Sharing screen, and here we go. Oh, share sound and optimize for video clip. Yes, all that good stuff. Here we go. So that's pretty representative of what I've seen.
Thank you.
So how is that prayer?
So yeah, it may not. This may be. I don't know if it's a super important distinction, but there is there's ecstatic prayer,
Yeah.
and there's ecstatic celebration.
Yeah, I mean, I
And
know what you're talking about. I was at the hotel, in '05, summer of '05, and I saw that ecstatic style of prayer there. But I couldn't film it because it was Shabbos, and the Israeli police have opinions about that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Um,
right,
Same.
right. So yeah, so I think very physical, and it could be more individual or it could be more communal. Of course, it's always gender segregated, right? It's but one of the criticisms of the early the Litvak, the Lithuanian Jews who were so scandalized by the Hasidic movement, because sometimes Hasidim would do like somersaults or they would do handstands in shul, and that for the Litvaks, that was not okay. It was disrespectful. But for the in the Hasidic philosophy, it was a pure expression of the joy of connecting with with God, with the divine energies of the world. And so, but that was one of the big disagreements between the Litvaks and the Hasidic world, was how enthusiastic it was okay to get and express oneself in a religious context like that. So thank you. That was great question. And Dan, thank you.
Sure.
Yeah.
I actually think I was searching while you were talking because I wanted to find. I didn't find what I was looking for, but I found something profoundly illustrative of their insistence that the divine truly is everywhere, which is, I've never seen this before, and we don't have to watch it if you don't want to, but the Sans Klausenberg Rebbe davening on the plane on the way to Israel.
You know what, Dan? Maybe you could take the URL and paste it into the...
Yeah, give me a sec doing that.
Yeah, that would be great. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. I will let you go on.
That would be great. Thank you so much. I appreciate. It's good to have these resources, just kind of emerge in the context of, in the course of our conversation. So that's terrific. So the last pieces of the Ba'al Shem Tov talk about how when he came in to the kind of Kabbalistic world, people were still very connected with this kind of ascetic, approach to things, this ascetic ethos of, self-denial. And he really pushed back against that. That was like one of the first things. These were people who were studying with him. And he said, no, that's not a way to serve the divine. You want to feel the joy and express it. He didn't seem to be intending to start a separate movement. He was teaching what he understood to be, the deeper truth of Jewish life. But he probably didn't start out to create a whole separate subset of the Jewish world, even though that's what ended up happening. He never discouraged, Jewish law was very important to him. There was an occasional willingness to like bend certain, timing aspects of Jewish law, but basically Jewish law was seen as, very important and as important as it was to other Orthodox Jews. He believed in the importance of Torah study too, so he was not anti-tradition in that way. But he did try to recalibrate things in the Jewish community. He wanted the community to move the mystics that were oriented, the Jewish mystically oriented people to move from asceticism to more kind of positive spiritualism. Yeah, so that's pretty much what I wanted to say about the Ba'al Shem Tov. Now, I do have, I don't know if I can, I'd probably have to share a screen if I wanted you to see this. I have this letter that the Ba'al Shem Tov wrote to his brother-in-law who was in Jerusalem. And it talks about this one very famous, there's only 4 short texts that historians believe they could say with a fair amount of confidence that Ba'al Shem Tov actually authored. And this is one of them. It's out there because it describes this ascent of the soul that he took. I had wanted to be able to get it into a folder for you guys, and I did not manage to do that. But let's see. Alan, if you make me a co-host, I am a co-host. Haha, thank you. All right. So let me just pull up. Hold on. Let's see. Where is the epistle? The epistle. Here we go. All right. Let me share screen. All right. Whoops. A little too far. All right. Can you guys see that? Okay. Maybe people could electronically raise your hand if you'd be willing to read a couple of 2 or 3 paragraphs. It's so, it's probably all right, Dan, you want to read the first? I'll just scroll as you read.
Sometimes I think I'm the only extrovert that I know. All right. To my beloved brother-in-law, my friend who is dear to me as my own heart and soul, the exalted Rabbi and Hasid, renowned for his Torah scholarship and fear of heaven, our master Rabbi Avraham Gershon, may his light shine. Peace unto him and his family, his modest wife Bluma, together with all their children, may they be blessed with life. Amen. Selah. I received the letter written by your holy hand, which you sent by means of the emissary from Jerusalem at the fair of Lucca in the year 5510, 1750. It was written with extreme brevity, and explained that you had already written at length to each of us individually, and had sent those letters by means of a certain man en route to Egypt. However, those letters never arrived, and I was sorely grieved that I never saw the work of your holy hand, which was written in greater detail. Assuredly, this is due to the calamitous state of the many lands in which the plague has spread because of our many transgressions. Not far from our region, the pestilence has reached the holy community of Mohilev, as well as Wallachia and Turkey. Your letter also states that the Torah teachings and mystical revelations which I sent you through the rabbi and preacher of the holy community of Polonia,
Yeah, I'm not sure.
did
Yeah.
not reach you. This, too, caused me great distress. It certainly would have given you great joy if they had reached you. I have since forgotten many of those teachings. However, the few details I still remember, I will write to you in brief.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Dan.
Sure.
Lila, you want to continue?
Okay. On Rosh Hashanah of the year 5507, which is 1746, I made an oath and elevated my soul in the manner known to you. I saw wondrous things in a vision, the like of which I had never witnessed since the day my mind first began to awaken. The things which I saw and learned when ascended there would be impossible to communicate, even if I could speak to you in person. When I returned to the lower Garden of Eden, I saw many souls, both living and dead, some known to me and others unknown. Their number was beyond reckoning. They were hastening back and forth in order to ascend from one world to another through the pillar known to those initiated into the mysteries. Their joy was too great for the mouth to express or the physical ear to hear. Also, many evildoers were repenting, and their sins were being forgiven, since it was a special time of divine favor. Even to me, it was amazing how many of them were accepted as penitents, a number of whom you also know. There's some gossip there. There was a great joy among them too, and they ascended in the same manner. They begged and implored me unceasingly. Because of the glory of your Torah, God has granted you an additional measure of understanding to grasp and to know these matters. Ascend with us so you can be our help and support. Because of the great joy that I beheld among them, I agreed to go with them. And I sought my master, Achia Hashiloni, to accompany me, for the ascent to the supernal worlds is fraught with danger. From the day of my birth until now, I never experienced such an ascent as this. Someone else want to read?
Anyone else want to read the last part of this letter? Okay, Alan, go ahead. Thanks, Lila.
Yeah.
I went up from level to level until I entered the palace of the Messiah, where the Messiah studies with the Tanaim, rabbinic sages, and tzaddikim, as well as the 7 shepherds. There I found extremely great rejoicing, but I did not know the cause of this delight. At first, I thought that it might be due to my having passed away from the physical world, God forbid. Later, they told me that I had not yet died, for they have great pleasure on high when I effect mystical unifications in the world below through their holy Torah. However, to this very day, the nature of their joy remains unknown to me. I asked the Messiah, "When will you come, Master?" And he replied, "By this you shall know. It will be a time when your teachings become publicized and revealed to the world, and your well springs have overflowed to the outside. When that which I have taught you and that which you have perceived of your own efforts become known, so that others too will be able to perform the mystical unifications in the sense of the soul like you, then all the evil klipot shells will be destroyed, and it will be a time of grace and salvation." I was amazed at this and greatly troubled, since a long time must pass for this to be possible. But while I was there, I learned 3 segulot and 3 holy names, which are easy to learn and explain. My mind was then set at ease, and I thought that with these teachings, the people of my own generation might attain the same spiritual level and state as myself. They would be able to elevate their souls and to learn and perceive just as I do. However, I was not granted permission to reveal this during my lifetime. I pleaded for you to be allowed, for your sake, to be allowed to teach you, but I was denied permission altogether and took an oath to that effect. Yet this I can tell you, and may God assist you, that your way may be pleasant to the Lord, and that you do not go astray, particularly in the Holy Land. Whenever you pray or study, and with every utterance your lips intend to bring about the unification of a divine name, for every letter contains worlds and souls and godliness, and they ascend and combine and unite with one another. Then the letters combine and unite to form a word, and they are actually unified with the divine essence. And in all these aspects, your soul is bound up with them.
Thank you, Alan. So, okay, I clipped it a little bit at the end, but I think you guys you get the bulk of the letter. So it's pretty interesting text, and you wonder what kind of an experience. I mean, he clearly had some experience. It's like he had an experience that he was reporting on. But we could talk about what might have generated it. Anyway, this is a famous text because it's really one of 3 or 4 that most scholars believe that Ba'al Shem Tov did pen. And so I don't know. Any questions? What do you think about? I don't know. I know it's a little bit out of this world, literally, and so it kind of is I think it gives expression to a lot of the ideas that we've been talking about. You can see how they play out in his life. Lila.
Sorry. So it reminds me of other mystic texts where there's reference to great mystic secrets that unfortunately cannot be revealed in this letter or at this time or to this person. So you never actually hear it. So we're always kind of chasing the real experience. And so, although he did go to a place where he saw folks, some he knew. So, was there a psychedelic drug involved with his
I don't
practice of the
know.
herbs?
I don't know what he was very he said he was very he said to his brother-in-law, I took an assent in the way that you are familiar with, like, so what does that mean? It's so anyway, it's a good question. Julia?
So there's little that I am more skeptical of than someone who says, I saw this thing, but I was sworn by God that I can't tell you.
Yeah.
Like that, I mean, I I really, really cannot. Yeah, I can't with the whole I saw this thing, but you aren't divine enough for me to explain it to you is something that
Right.
I am inherently extremely averse to. And so I saw that and I just um am extremely skeptical.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Right. He does not come across as a very humble person in this letter. He he clearly sees himself
Yeah,
as
it's I agree with them. It just makes me think of Joseph Smith, who insisting that he read these things on the golden plates, and I've always thought Joseph Smith was clearly an extremely talented con artist.
right.
And I'm not saying the Ba'al Shem Tov was, but I agree. Say, oh, I had this experience, but I'm not allowed to tell you.
So right. Okay. Well. Okay. We got a bunch of people. So Nancy, and then um, Nancy Allen Maxine. Nancy Allen Maxine. Okay.
So I don't know about the last couple of comments, but what it was making me think about is all the other traditions that have these moments where people have ecstatic experiences that sort of overlap descriptively in what people feel. So I did a fair amount of shamanic study back in the day, and Lila, you were asking about hallucinogens, and of course that was part of that tradition, but also just drumming was just the beat of a drum repeatedly. And I did a couple of workshops where you really do get almost into a hypnotic state, a hallucinogenic state through just drumming. And also the Sufis with the Sufi dance.
Right.
There's a lot of traditions that have this same kind of expression. And I just guess I feel like when I hear about that from all around the world in a time when we didn't have the technology that we have here, it does give me pause to think it's possible because it came from so many different corners of human experience over so many years. That, and those weren't people that were talking to each other, and they weren't in cahoots for any particular purpose, but they were sharing similar kind of things that they were doing that they could transcend human experience. I just think that's sort of interesting.
That's great. Thank you. Thanks, Nancy. Alan?
Yeah, I'm on the same path that Nancy was. Areas I think that if we're talking about these concepts of God, this unknowable but all-pervasive force and of energy in the world, there's so much of a realm that is there, So if we throw out all of those concepts and we just say it's all about ethics, or praying to a God that we have no idea who we're praying to, but it's like us, but just somewhere else, maybe he decides to grant us. But we're not connected to this. It's not something that we can ever experience. It's just we are rooted to our human everyday experience, and that's all. And when we die, maybe if we're lucky, we'll get to go and experience something more. To me, that's not how religions got started, and I don't think it's so extraordinary for individuals to have. It's extraordinary, but I don't think it's unbelievable that humans would have that experience.
Thank you. Thanks, Alan. Yeah, like it as Nancy was talking, I was thinking, so like, the Hasidic part of our tradition, it's like Jewish Sufism in a certain way. I mean, it's not, there are lots of ways that it's not parallel, but I mean, that is where a lot of the ecstatic energy of our tradition gets channeled. Maxine?
Well, the one thing that struck me was he nonchalantly was talking about the Messiah. Well, I talked to the Messiah, and this isn't the time. It's like, couldn't you give a little more information? Like, is that Jesus, or is it a woman, or, I mean, how do you just brush off, saw the Messiah? No, this isn't the time. So that just
Right.
struck
Right.
me as odd, very odd.
I will just underscore that he, at least in the letter, he did mention that he had never, none of his ascents had ever been like this one. And maybe, of course, if the Messiah's presence was part of that unique, part of the uniqueness of this experience, you would think he would have made more of a big deal, like you're saying, Maxine, about like, oh my God, I saw the Messiah. I couldn't believe it. Like I've seen the souls. I love that reference to the pillar too. Like those who do, who know about the mystical secrets, they know about the pillar that the souls use to go from world to world. I thought that was a kind of a fascinating little, because he said it so, it was pretty nonchalant, but it was also very mysterious at the same time.
Well, also, how did he know it was the Messiah? Did he come up and say, "Hi, I'm the Messiah. Nice to meet you"? Just kind of a strange comment about it. So
someone should write a play that like totally expands on this letter and fills in all those questions, right? Like that would be a Maxine, that would be a cool thing to do. And you could say, the Ba'al Shem Tov, you come up with some kind of a clever name for the play, and I think a lot of people would be interested.
Sounds like a Purim spiel to me.
There is actually a song that is nearly along these lines that's already out there.
Oh, do tell.
Oh, sure. It's called Jerusalem by Dan Byrne, Bern.
Oh, cool.
I can put that up too if you want, but whatever.
Or you know what? Could you put a link to that in the chat too? That would be good. Okay. Thank you.
It's a silly song. It's not at all a serious theological commentary, but he explains that he is the Messiah. But anyway, it's as a joke, but anyway.
Okay.
Yeah, I think his nickname was Messy. You can just call me Messy.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much. Thanks, both of you. Carol?
Yeah, I mean, just to sort of echo what Nancy and Alan said, I'm not looking at the literal letter, but, when I was in Svat, you'd hear stories. I mean, when I went that time with the Kabbalah, once in a while we'd hear these freaky things, and it would come up of like where people taking hallucinogenics, or whatever, but, there'd be all these stories about people going kind of in the fields, fasting for days, meditating. I mean, that's part of the tradition. It reminds me very much of Native American vision quests. And like Nancy said, there's just too many other, practices, cultures, or whatever, where there's these parallel experiences that I'm not saying we have it valid proof, but it's just a little eerie to me that there's an overlap. And, you know, I'm not saying this letter per se, but I don't know. To me, it's like, I think you could look at a felt sense. But one thing I did want to ask Steve about the whole thing with Hasidism, I thought the overall view, I'm not talking in particular, you know, a person or a practice, but that if you weren't that part of Judaism or practice was reserved to people that were very learned and
Yes.
could read and all that type of thing. And what made this whole movement, one of the reasons it caught on so much is that it was obtainable by like the common person, that there could, you know, not everyone would have the time to go meditate in the field, but that there was, that it brought some joy, it brought some sense that it's not like you had to, you know, memorize all the mitzvot or the laws or whatever, but that it sort of built community, and that it was a lot about faith or so. And but I don't know if there was a particular person or if that's just something I heard, and I can't reference where I heard it, but it was an overall sense of you know, the mystics, the movements.
Absolutely, yes. And I should have included that at the very beginning. Yes, that is absolutely, because when the Ba'al Shem Tov had these practices where all you needed to do, that really focused on the letters, as opposed to, you know, you didn't need to know the meaning of the word even, but just being able to visualize the letters of the prayer book, and that was a powerful meditative experience, or that you could connect with God, you know, with the divine when you were going, you know, when you were doing your work, you know, during the week, or you were having a conversation with someone in the street, and all of that was fair game for, you know, divine service. That absolutely opened up, where you don't have to be a scholar to participate in this, and to have, you know, to have a sense of belonging. You know, most common Jews didn't feel like they belonged to the rabbinic, you know, elite, because those guys would sit around and talk, you know, they debate Talmudic, you know, arguments together, and the common Jews had no clue about what they were talking about. But with these things, it was accessible. There were ways in that everybody would work for everybody. So absolutely, that's, I think, probably, you know, one of the biggest things that made it grow so substantially and so quickly and have so much staying power, is because everybody felt included. Yeah, thank you for asking that question. I appreciate it.
And one other thing, like threaded through that, because I keep looking at Mark, even though he doesn't know about our years, you know, some of us were in Rabbi Stone's Musar class, and not that it's parallel, but it definitely overlays about, you know, because it very much emphasizes the holy and everyday acts. You know, you could do anything, and it's very much also something of a not necessarily just a divine experience, but a people to people experience. And I know it just threads through. So
Right. I have read that Musar could be seen as the Litvak response to Hasidism.
yeah,
Like it was a way of creating exactly what you described, Carol. You know, like, and anybody could have access to it, right? You didn't have to be a scholar to go to the Musar gatherings, and so yeah, absolutely, yeah. Lila, and then Mimi.
So I've been thinking about these guys, Ba'al Shem Tov and Rebbe Nachman, and as like charismatic, like they must have attracted these followings because they were themselves charismatic leaders. But in the letter, I mean, what is sort of revealed is a practice, a community of practice. Like, his brother-in-law knows what he's talking about, like, which is, I don't know, it sort of complicates how widespread was that, and like how high up did you have to be before you got to know about the pillar, say? So I don't know.
Yeah, that's a good question, and I think what happens and as Hasidism unfolds, and as the Rebbe, the tzaddik, really becomes the center of the community, and the tzaddik, and maybe the people in the very inner circle of the tzaddik are the people who are willing to or allowed to engage in this kind of practice. And most of the Hasidim, that's not what they do. The tzaddikim are the ones who are seen as competent to engage in this, otherworldly kind of experience, and the Hasidim benefit from it. And the tzaddikim have in their identity, their role is to use their spiritual power to help their Hasidim, because their Hasidim are not able to access it in the same way. So I think there is this kind of eventually boundary that gets put around the highest, the most intense kind of practice that one could engage in, and you have to you probably have to really make a proactive effort to break into circles where this kind of thing is happening, and being shared. Thank you, Mark.
I was gonna.
I'm sorry, Mark. I apologize, Mimi. Right, sorry, I lost track. Yeah.
Oh no, I had put my hand down, but thank you. So I remember when Chabad of Cleveland, they opened when I was in high school, and we all went there, like with youth group or whatever, and we were dancing and this and that. And the way they explained the founding of Hasidism was they said that Judaism had become this sort of mournful, lugubrious religion where all people did was mourn the destruction of the temple. That was the emphasis. There was little or no joyfulness in any of the holidays. And that Hasidism was the attempt to bring joy back into the religion of Judaism. So I don't know if that was just an oversimplified explanation for high school kids, but I just wondered what people think of that.
Yeah, I mean, to me that's a little, that feels like it's erasing too much, stuff that came in between, and it doesn't acknowledge the real world events that really led up to, including the massacres, the Chmelnytsky massacres, and then the Shabtai Tzvi, debacle. And so, I mean, I think at the time that Hasidism emerged, it's true that a lot of the common Jewish people, they were suffering, they were struggling. They didn't have a lot of stuff in their, they had Shabbat, and they had the holidays, but even those were probably a struggle because they didn't even have the resources to celebrate these things in a way that they probably learned they were supposed to. So, but that the story that it sounds like you were told by the Chabad of Cleveland makes it sound like, basically all of post-temple Judaism was a drag until Hasidism came along, and I think that it's much more nuanced, and kind of there's much more of an ebb and a flow, I guess I would say.
Yeah, that
Than it kind of going in one direction continuously until the Ba'al Shem Tov comes on the scene, and then he switches the direction single-handedly. So, but there is this emphasis on joy. That's true. That's true. And a lot of the common people weren't experiencing that very much in their lives, I don't think. So I think that part of it is correct.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mimi. Mark.
I missed last week's class, so you might have already covered this, and if so, I'll continue to watch the rest of it. But and kind of following up on what Lila said, I'm always trying to understand how exactly all of this got transmitted, and do we really know? Like, from what I understand, at best, there's this understanding that there is a hidden mystical tradition that does various things, perhaps even healing, but certainly kind of unlocks the mysteries of the universe. But it's only been passed orally, right? And somehow the Ba'al Shem Tov knew people who existed before him who had this secret knowledge, right? But he made it manifest and apparent in a way that other teachers didn't before him, right? Is that fair to say?
So, I think a lot of the tradition was oral, but there were books written too, but they were guarded, because people saw them as being potentially dangerous if they got into the wrong hands. And, it goes to, this tripartite division of the mystical tradition, of the theosophy, the ecstatic, and the magical. And there's a relatively, one of the more modern scholars of Hasidism. I'm totally blanking on his name. He's an Israeli scholar of Kabbalah, and he has a book called Hasidism Between Ecstasy and Magic. And so he argues that Hasidism is kind of a fusion of the ecstatic and the magical dimensions of the mystical tradition, and the theosophy is, for the most part, falls to the background, with the lone exception of Chabad, because the founder of Chabad, and we're not going to get to him tonight, but Shneur Zalman of Liadi, his book, the Tanya, is actually a very heavy-duty work of mysticism and of theosophy. And I don't know that there's things in there that people would term magical, but it's a very deep work. And he was highly criticized by some of his Hasidic colleagues for writing this stuff in a book, because they said it didn't belong, and it was going to get into the wrong hands. So I think there were, like, in the post-Lurianic world, one of the things that happened is that a lot of Kabbalah that had been more orally transmitted did get written down. There were, and especially after the printing press was invented, there were books of Kabbalah that were printed and distributed, and that's part of why Lurianic Kabbalah became mainstream Judaism for about 100 years, because these books were, now, being able to read a book didn't mean you could pick up any of these books and know what you were reading. Yeah. But if you had a teacher, or if there was a group in town that you knew that was, getting together, more people had access to it. So there are legends about the Ba'al Shem Tov that he studied, that there were some famous Ba'al Shem in the region that he got connected to, but there is no historical support for that. I mean, there's no proof that didn't happen, but the other thing that's kind of interesting is that some of the more mystically leaning people that lived in the region that the Ba'al Shem Tov was born in were people that historians know had ties to the Sabbatean movement.
Ah,
So some of the books that the Ba'al Shem Tov might have read when he was a young person searching for mystical secrets might have been books that were written by people that had ties to Shabtai Tzvi and, his students. So, but the Ba'al Shem Tov wouldn't have known that, because these people were all very secretive, because Shabtai Tzvi had a very, people didn't want to talk about him for the most part. So if you were someone who had any kind of tie to him, you did not broadcast that to the general Jewish world, because you could get yourself in trouble very quickly. So anyway, no, it's good. It's and I don't know that there's any definitive answer to that question, but I do know that there were books that existed. There were books of Jewish magic that existed, book on how to write amulets for different kinds of situations. Books, all kinds of, the magical piece was looked down upon by the other people who practiced the other branches of mysticism. But then I think with Hasidism, magic kind of got brought in a little more deeply, like, because the Ba'al Shem Tov and some of his, a lot of the stories about him were that he could do things like, he could appear in two places at once, and he could, he could get from point A to point B much more quickly than a human being should be able to. And so anyway, it's interesting.
is it worth us reading some of the stories of the Ba'al Shem Tov and talking about them?
I mean,
I just mean, like, is it shed light on the movement to be familiar with those stories?
I'm sure it would.
Okay.
Sure it would. I do not know that I could be a very good guide to, like, analyzing the stories, in terms of the structures and themes that, there is a really there is a chapter in a book that deals with different genres of Jewish literature, and there's a chapter that deals with Hasidic literature, and that's maybe something we could have an additional or a separate gathering to read and discuss. So thank you guys for sticking with this all the way through to 9, and so next week we'll have our third session. So we didn't get past the Ba'al Shem Tov tonight, so we'll definitely talk about the Maggid of Mezeritch and Shneur Zalman, and I hope we'll get to Rebbe Nachman a little bit too next week, and then we'll see where we're at, and if there's interest in doing something along the lines that Lila's suggesting, we can certainly look for a time to do that too. So have a good rest of the evening, and an early Shabbat Shalom, and maybe see some of you on Shabbat, either on site or online. And yeah, great to be here with all of you. See you soon. Bye. Thank you, Alan, for organizing everything. Bye.